Good morning. I was looking at this chronology and making sure I've covered everything. We're up to this point. We're right up to the time of Alexander the Great. We're, of course, studying the time period between the Testaments. And I'm going to, I told you that in the beginning of this class I was going to kind of follow Pfeiffer's outline or his book, how he approaches the study. I just went blank on his first name. Is it Charles? Okay, I was going to say, Charles didn't sound right for some reason, but I guess it is Charles. He kind of takes, it's almost like an interlude chapter at this point, and he talks about the problems, he calls it the problems and progress of the Jews. And so that's what I'm going to do this week, this class period. We started on that a little bit last week, but didn't quite get as into it as I'd hoped. And I'm going to, if I have to summarize at the end, we'll get this chapter covered today, and that way we can start, Lord willing, talking about the Grecian Empire and Alexander the Great next Sunday, because I don't want to get to where we don't have time to cover the world empires. But what he talks about in this chapter is important. I say it's almost like an interlude because a lot of studies I've seen, it just depends on who's putting the study together and how they arrange it. Sometimes people will save a lot of this for kind of the end. They'll go through the four world empires, the actual history of it, and say, okay, well, here's how this ties in with the Jews. Sometimes people will talk about each one of these, like we'll talk about the Synagogue. Sometimes people talk about that when they're talking about the Babylonian Empire, because as best we can tell, synagogues kind of sprang up and originated during that time period, although that's not 100% clear. But some people will do it as Pfeiffer does in his book and kind of insert it here, and that makes sense as well because, as he points out, this is kind of, he's sort of giving us, here's what's going on with the Jews up to this point. We talk about a lot of the history of it, of what's going on during this time period, this Persian Empire, and even going back some to the Babylonian Empire. But what about the Jews? What's going on with them? And especially beyond what we read about as you get kind of to the end of that timeline of the Old Testament around the time of Nehemiah's work. Well, what's happening after that? So that's, I sort of see where he's coming from. I'm trying to think of when I've never taught this as a class, but just discussing it maybe in a brief class or two or three classes. I think I did it more toward the end, but anyways, I want to, sometimes you have to kind of pick a plan and stick with it. And I, again, reading his chapter and how he approaches it, it makes sense. I won't rehash all the origins of the Samaritans because we talked about that last week. But I will say this, as we pointed out, the Samaritans had this amalgamation of Judaism and some paganism, and they kind of brought it together in this, they called it Judaism, but it wasn't. It's kind of like, sometimes you see folks today that will say, I'm a Christian, and you can many times spend just a little bit of time talking to them and realize they don't understand at all what it means to be a Christian. Maybe the process of becoming a Christian, maybe the life of a Christian. And so we see some similar things today, but that's what you have with the Samaritans. And we talked a little bit about, Sanballat and the problems he caused for Nehemiah. He tried to say, hey, we're going to work with you. And Nehemiah says, you're not working with us because you don't have the pure religion of Jehovah, or Yahweh, as sometimes people pronounce it. And so then Sanballat and his cronies decide, okay, well, maybe we can distract and deter Nehemiah from the work. Come down and meet with us in the valley of Ono. Not going to do that. Okay, well, if you don't stop this, we're going to forcibly stop you. And, again, Nehemiah continues on, and we've talked before what a great study of leadership that is. And in 52 days, they rebuild the wall around Jerusalem. So that was Nehemiah's work. Of course, Ezra's dealing more on the side of restoring the law, but they worked together. And, the Samaritans, there's just this constant clash. And all that is to help us to understand, but also to understand that when you get to the New Testament, there is such, and I've said it before, it's not every single Samaritan, it's not every single Jew, but for the most part, there is such a loathing of one another on the part of these two nationalities, races, however you want to put that. They just don't like each other. And as mentioned last week, a Jew would typically go around Samaria if he's going somewhere instead of going through it, because he felt like somehow that's going to just defile him. We sometimes tease about, if you're a Auburn fan, Alabama fan, Georgia fan, or whatever, people sometimes would make jokes about, I'm not even going to drive through Tuscaloosa. I'm just going to find a way to go around it because I don't want to be defiled. Maybe they're big Auburn fans, or maybe Alabama fans says, I'm not going to drive through Auburn. I'm just going to, even if that's, the quickest way. That's how a Jew would do that. And of course, in those times, it was, you talk about a quicker way, or a longer way rather, it is a much longer way. But that helps us to understand a little bit of the animosity and just general distaste they had for each other. If you open up your New Testament and you start reading about this, especially in John 4, and this lady says, Jews have no dealings with Samaritans. So why are you talking to me? A, she says, I'm a woman. B, I'm a Samaritan. And of course, we're learning from Jesus there, and his disciples, hopefully, we're learning that the gospel's for all. The gospel's not just going to the Jews only. It's going to go to the whole world. And God's bringing everybody together in one in Christ. Now, we started talking a little bit about this Jewish settlement, colony, if you want to call it that, group that was found at this area of Egypt. We refer to it as Elephantine. He spends, if you want to get a little bit more information, you can look in Pfeiffer's book, but I'm going to kind of summarize here. And they excavated this area as a little island there in the early 1900s. I think he says like 1907, 1908, something like that. 1907, 1908. And they unearthed a number of papyri, and these were, I think we kind of touched on this last week, they were mostly secular documents. These are not like copies of Scripture or anything like that, but it tells a lot about their lives. Just it may be an IOU, it may be a here this has been paid, but they did discover something that it's not a copy of Scripture, but it was at least related to religious life, and it was a copy of a letter that was sent to the governor of Judea, back home in the Palestinian area, asking for help. And, again, kind of giving you the Reader's Digest version, there were some Egyptian priests there in that Elephantine area who got some cooperation from the governor's son there in that part of Egypt, and probably some other government officials as well. I mean, if you're an Egyptian and you have all those Egyptian gods, you reckon you might resent, here's this nice temple that was built to honor Jehovah, Yahweh. So it probably didn't take a whole lot of coercion and convincing to get several Egyptians, both common people and higher up, to help out. But basically the temple was destroyed. They had built a temple there at Elephantine, a temple for God, Jehovah, and it had been destroyed. They're writing to Judea to say, hey, our brethren in Judea, we need some help. Could you help us to rebuild this temple? And no doubt they want some financial help. It's kind of like, we do this today, right? Sometimes a congregation falls on hard times. It may be some kind of a hardship, and they make an appeal to brethren. Could you help us out to offset these expenses or whatever? Sometimes, it was just a few years ago, right? Jacksonville area got hit real hard with a tornado, and several congregations got together and sent money over there to help them to, do some rebuilding and stuff. And so, that's kind of what the letter is in a nutshell. they want assistance to rebuild this temple. And it's interesting. You say, well, what does all this have to do? It's interesting because in this letter we learn something about these Jews there at Elephantine. We learn, number one, they had this temple, obviously, because they're asking for help to rebuild it. But they had a priestly and a sacrificial system that was modeled after that in Jerusalem. They also, we learn from this, though, kind of had that, as I mentioned just a moment ago with the Samaritans, this amalgamation going on of, oh, we worship Jehovah. In fact, they had this in those documents. Jehovah is referred to, of course, in Hebrew, it's people dispute it or whatever, but typically people pronounce it Yahweh, something similar to that. And then, of course, kind of we end up with our word Jehovah in English. But they have it in those documents as Yahoo or even Yahoo. But they weren't faithful. They weren't maintaining purity in worship, and they even had other gods. In fact, there was a Canaanite goddess that was considered a consort of Baal, and is mentioned along with these Elephantine Jews, and it seems like they had kind of the idea that she was a consort of Yahweh. So it's like they're worshiping Jehovah, but boy, they're messed up. And again, can we relate today? Because you sometimes meet somebody on the street, maybe in conversation, you say, well, I'm a Christian. In fact, it was a few years ago. Some of us, I was with some people from Bremen, and we're dealing with an obnoxious, absolutely narcissistic, just I don't know, I just one of the most difficult human beings I've ever had the misfortune of dealing with. And this guy is telling us, some of us were staying in his property in Florida, and he's just upset, and he is, he wants us gone, and this is like 10:30 at night. You got to go, and the guy reeks of alcohol. The old saying, cussing enough to make a sailor blush. And so one of the things that we tell him, and they're trying to reason with this guy, say, look, we it's 10:30, going on 11 o'clock at night. Well, okay, I'll tell you what, you can be gone by 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. I said, look, that's not going to work. We're getting up, and we're all going to be going to worship in the morning. We go to church. Well, so do I. And we're like, I think Mike and I, maybe we're standing there talking to him at that point, and we're kind of like, do you? But, we run into situations like that even now where somebody, you're talking to somebody and something comes up about being a Christian. Oh, so am I. And here's somebody, they may be engaging in all kinds of immorality, even right there as they say that. They may betray that they don't understand or at least respect what the Bible says about living as a Christian. And that's not to say that anybody is perfect, but there's a difference in somebody who's striving to live like a Christian, live like the Lord, model their lives after the Lord, and somebody who's just kind of, I'm going to do whatever I want, but I'm going to call myself a Christian. And that's kind of what you see here with these Elephantine Jews. And so it shows that, you kind of understand some of the development of the Jewish religion during this time. And they didn't have this purity of worship. They worshiped other gods. Pfeiffer does spend some time in his book talking about the origin, and it's kind of the exact origin is a mystery. But, we do learn a lot about the development of the Jewish religion during the Persian period from this, just if nothing else, this letter from those Jews at Elephantine back toward Palestine. And their temple, their fully developed sacrificial system, that indicates they had rejected this idea of a centralized sanctuary for worship, which was, central, right, under the old law. The prophets are, and in fact, you see, a constant battle, especially during the divided kingdom. The prophets are telling people, worship centers around Jerusalem, the temple, which represented God's presence among his people, right? But then you have all these references over in the prophets, in the book of Kings, in the book of Chronicles, to what was often translated as, and I think it's King James, and I think the other versions keep this translation, but it's so often translated as the high places. And so instead of centralized worship here in Jerusalem at the temple, well, we're just going to go out over here. In fact, I can't remember if it's Amos or Hosea that says something to the effect of, go and sacrifice under every green tree and in all your high places, because this liketh you. And it's, if you want to Chad Dollahite paraphrase that, he says, go on and do what you want to do, because that's what you're going to do anyways. You're going to do just whatever you like. So go ahead. But there will be consequences. You know, your mom or dad ever say that to you growing up? A couple of times when I'd just argue with my dad, and sometimes he'd say, you know what, go ahead. Oh, so you're giving me permission? Sometimes I'd say, I'm going to clarify this. And he'd say, you do what you want, but there will be consequences. And you need to understand, you got to face the consequences of your choices. Well, that's kind of what many times the prophets would say, that you're just doing whatever you want, but there are going to be consequences for that. These Jews there at Elephantine, they no doubt considered themselves Orthodox. I mean, they had this priestly system, this sacrificial system that was modeled after Jerusalem. They had built a temple for some type of centralization at least. So they, there's no doubt they considered themselves Orthodox. It's interesting, by the way, their letter, it actually mentions that they had made appeals to the Samaritans for help as well. Pfeiffer says something to the effect of, they just didn't see the need. They didn't deem it necessary to take sides in that conflict. I don't know that I would have put it that way. I think I would say, as I heard many times growing up, it sounds more like they're kind of talking out of both sides of their mouth, as we sometimes say. They're maybe trying to play both sides there. Well, maybe we could get some help from the Jewish brethren. Maybe we could get some help from these Samaritans. And, we got enough in common with both of them that we can, and they try to make this appeal for assistance. I don't know. Maybe they just kind of thought, well, we're just going to stay out of this conflict. But it wasn't a matter of just taking sides. It almost sounds like when you say it that way, like this is just an argument. But the fact remains, these Elephantine Jews were not maintaining the purity of Judaism that was over and over and over again insisted upon by the prophets of Jehovah. But all this is to help us understand the development of the Jewish religion during that Persian period. But it's also to say this. Let's be honest. Have you not ever opened up the book of Nehemiah or maybe Ezra and thought, ease up, guys. They want to help you. They want to help you build the wall. They want to help you build the temple. Accept the help, man. Yeah, they're not perfect, but why not let them help out? Have you ever read Nehemiah or Ezra maybe or studied about them and thought they were a bit, I like the term that Pfeiffer uses, puritanical? Man, a bit over the top, isn't it? I don't mind standing here and telling you I've thought that before. Like even trying to understand, not that, not sitting here going, questioning the inspiration of the Bible or anything necessarily, but I'm sitting here thinking, okay, well, why not help them and maybe try to bring them along? It shows us, it helps us to understand why that was, because they see what happens as people get away from their moorings or leave their moorings. Again, I wrote down a quote here from Pfeiffer on page 58 of his book. Elephantine shows the danger which beset a community which left its moorings and allowed a religious syncretism in which Yahweh could be associated with a pantheon of deities. Now, here you are. You've just gotten out of captivity. It's still very, very recent. That wound is still pretty raw and open at the time of Nehemiah and Ezra. And here comes some brethren, and I'm using that term as they would call themselves, and they say, hey, we're going to help you. We're going to join with you And you mean old Jewish people won't even let us. But if you're over here on the Jewish side, you're going, why don't we just get out of 70 years of captivity? Idolatry, one of the major reasons. That and failure to keep the Sabbath. And you're over here and you say you're our brethren, you worship Yahweh, but you also worship, in many cases, many other gods. How about no? You can stay far, far away from us because we've learned our lesson about trying to mix God with other so-called deities. And we're not going down that road again. So, if it seems like they're puritanical or if it seems like they're mean, understand that's why. And it shows when you look at the community there at Elephantine in Egypt, you see this is where it goes to. And many times they're the mixing in and it starts to erode spirituality. And you see that, by the way, when Nehemiah comes back. The book of Nehemiah, we've talked about that before. He goes to rebuild the walls, and the king had asked him, what is your request? Set him a time. Nehemiah goes back to the palace, and then, there's a period of a few years that pass, several years, and he returns to Jerusalem, and he finds out that they had quickly corrupted themselves again. There's intermarrying, they're not respecting the Sabbath, and Nehemiah has to make some reforms. Again, Ezra deals with the mixed marriage problem as well there in the book of Ezra. So that's the reason we mentioned Elephantine Jews. Understand that's a cautionary tale, if you want to use that term, of what happens when they leave their moorings, as he puts it, and they allow this syncretism, again, using his term, where you can associate God with just this pantheon of deities. And so that's the reason for their refusal to cooperate with those Samaritans. Next thing he covers in his chapter is the synagogue. I will mention this. I was looking, like I said, I use Pfeiffer's book kind of as my main source, or especially as far as arranging the study. But I look at a lot of different other works and studies. But there's one fellow that he mentions at this point the dispersion, or it's sometimes called the diaspora. Some people jump in on how you pronounce it. Let's turn to John 7:35. There's a term used here that's John 7, verse 35. Somebody just read that for us loud and clear when you get there, please. All right, so the dispersion, is that New King James? The King James just says dispersed. Most of the newer versions actually have it as the dispersion. And that's the word in Greek is diaspora. It's a term that describes the scattering of the Jews outside of Palestine, and I think that's pretty obvious just from the usage of it. But again, this is one of those terms you come to the New Testament, and if you don't have some kind of a concept, you read that and you say, well, is he going to go to the dispersion? What's the dispersion? And I guess he means some dispersion of Jews, but all throughout the Old Testament, you're reading about the Jews centralized right there in Palestine, except for the captivity. But then they come home, so how is there this dispersion? Well, when you study between the Testaments, you understand that they were allowed to go home, but not everybody went home. Some people stayed. Various reasons for that. We don't always know the reasons. Daniel is a classic example. Daniel never went home. Why? I don't know. You don't know, because the Bible doesn't ever tell us. There's nothing to indicate why. It may be because he was kind of up in the government and had responsibilities there, but there may be other reasoning as well. But not everybody went home. And of course, this Jewish colony that we just talked about there in Elephantine, some of them stayed. They weren't in Egyptian captivity, you recall, right? But the Persian Empire, the Babylonian Empire, of course, Nebuchadnezzar, as Jerusalem fell, some of those Jews decide we're going to run to Egypt for help, and God, through Jeremiah, says, you can run to Egypt all you want, but Nebuchadnezzar's coming to kick down the door of Egypt as well. And, of course, Persia ended up fully conquering Egypt. But some Jews settled there at that spot in Elephantine, and they established this colony. And so not everybody went home, and they began to, be at different places all around. Tim, you were going to say something.
John 7:35. Does your translation say dispersion or dispersed?
Dispersed is what the King James has.
I thought you were saying dispersion is starting to say it.
Yeah, the newer versions like New King James and ESV and some of them will have dispersion, which is the idea there from the Greek word diaspora. So the dispersion among the Gentiles, and that's what that's talking about, is where these Jews settled in different places. And one fellow mentions, again, I'm going to try to pick and choose here so I don't take too much time. I was looking for one particular quote I saw. This is from Zondervan Pictorial Encyclopedia of the Bible under diaspora. By New Testament times, it was estimated that more Jews lived outside of Palestine, perhaps as many as 3 to 5 million, than lived in the homeland. I believe we mentioned that before in a real quick, brief overview of intertestamental period. The number of Jews living actually in the Palestinian area compared to the dispersion, it didn't even compare. The number, in fact, you even see this in the book of Nehemiah, where they're having to bring people to live, to settle in Jerusalem. They're having to try to find enough people to come and settle the city, because compared to the number of Jews there's just a tiny amount that had come back to live there in Jerusalem. So Josephus makes the statement, there is not a community in the entire world which does not have a portion of our people. So, you see this because Paul will go on his preaching tours, missionary trips we sometimes call them, and he'll visit Asia and Europe. And, what's typically the first thing he does? Synagogue. And if there's a synagogue, guess what? Well, that's a Jewish community, right? Yeah, in fact, that's what we're getting into now, talking about. So I just want to mention that so we understand. Again, I think we talked about that before, but make sure we understand that, the Jews were allowed to go home, but that didn't mean every single Jew chose to go home. And so the synagogue, we've talked about this before, but just to sort of summarize, the origin of the synagogue is some people say difficult to determine. I almost tempted to say impossible to determine. Jewish tradition tells us that it sprang up during the Babylonian exile. Jewish tradition is reliable in many respects, but it's not always 100% reliable. Sometimes, things get exaggerated, things get altered, but that is what Jewish tradition tells us. We do know it didn't become common, the synagogue, until intertestamental times. Yes, sir?
Acts chapter 2, verse 9 through 11, talks about people that come from all over places, seemingly Jews. Is this part of this concept that they were dispersed at one time? That's why they're coming from all these different regions to Jerusalem?
Yes, for Pentecost.
Yes.
Yeah, that would be the dispersion. The statement Tim was mentioning was from Acts 2, 9 through 11, where it mentions several different nationalities there, people that had come from all over. And yeah, that would be people from the dispersion. In fact, you'll see that with the synagogue kind of getting a little bit ahead, but I'm going to have to summarize anyways because I'm running short on time. But you'll see this. The synagogues, long story short, they became common for worship and a lot of even everyday life. It would be, sometimes even our church building here. People are in and out of the church building, and maybe they're coming to help set up. It could be setting up for a shower or for something special going on a Sunday or something like that. They would do that with the synagogue. But then they would have their, of course, for them, under the old law, Sabbath service. And that was the center of their worship. And, they would even have children's classes and things like that. But they didn't do sacrifices there because that was for the temple at Jerusalem. And when it was Passover, when it was Tabernacles, Feast of Tabernacles, when it was Pentecost, well, you still go to Jerusalem. Not everybody could do that, and there were even provisions in the law for certain, special circumstances. But yeah, the ones that could, they would come from all over, and they would gather, and that's why, it's, again, you see the wisdom of God there, providence of God, making sure it's on a time when you've got so many people gathered there in Jerusalem. And by the way, I don't know if we've ever pointed this out before, but when you study Acts 4, I think maybe we did talk about this at some point, but when you study the rest of Acts 2, Acts 3, Acts 4 especially, and you see this, some people have even gone to Acts 4 and tried to talk about some type of communism, that the early church practiced communism because all things were common. What you have there is a very special, unique situation because all these Jews from the dispersion come for the feast. They're there for the day of Pentecost, which centered, 50 days after Passover. So many of them obey the gospel. About 3,000 souls obeyed the gospel. Well, now what? Some of them just basically parked it in Jerusalem because this is a major change. And so they're kind of like Mary in Luke 10, 38 through 42. They just sort of park it at the feet of the apostles and say, teach us more, tell us more. So what else has changed? What else do we need to know? What about when I do go back home? So you're telling me I don't worship on the Sabbath anymore? And so there are all these different things, and so some of them just, as I said, kind of, we might say, just parked it there in Jerusalem. We don't know how long. Some of them may have even stayed. Who knows? So you got a very unique situation, and they, of course, they have needs. This is not home. They don't have a place to stay. They don't have, may not have brought enough money. Of course, you're not working because you've come for this trip, and now you need food, and so on and on we could go. But yeah, that would be a lot of them coming from what we call the dispersion, and coming many of them from far away. So again, the synagogue, as far as where did it exactly originate from, seems to be during the time of the Babylonian captivity. But again, that's Jewish tradition. The word synagogue means a gathering of people, synagogue in the Greek. The Hebrew word for such a gathering is Knesset. I'm not really good with pronouncing Hebrew words, but it's actually the same name used for the parliament in the modern state of Israel. So I don't know if somebody watches news enough, you may be able to pronounce that. I've not heard it. The temple was rebuilt, of course, after its destruction. Nehemiah rebuilding the walls, Ezra restoring the walls, Zerubbabel rebuilding the temple, or at least began under Zerubbabel. It was later finished. Herod the Great is going to do these magnificent temple upgrades, I guess we want to call it that, and it's going to be something like, even during the time of Jesus, they say 40 years this temple's been in building. So there were renovations, I guess maybe that'd be the better term to use, going on for up to 40 years, and those were still ongoing, by the way, when they said that to Jesus. There was still work being done. It was magnificent. Of course, that's all going to come tumbling down in AD 70. Kind of a final severing that God makes with the physical, fleshly nation of Israel. But these synagogues, you're in captivity. You can't go home for feasts. You can't go to the temple to sacrifice. But would you, as a faithful Jew, still want to pray to God? Would you still want to worship? So now what? Pfeiffer has an interesting, he just kind of puts this under the origin of the synagogue, but I think it is important to mention at least. There was an idea in ancient cultures. Wars, as he puts it, were fought on two levels. There were the humans that fought, but then there were also the deities. And if you lost, guess what? Well, your deity is the weaker God. In fact, you see this, by the way, when Sennacherib, the king of Assyria, he lays siege to Judah and he sends messengers to Hezekiah, and he's speaking to the people of Judah, and he says what? Where are the gods of Hamath? Where are the gods of Arpad, Sepharvaim, Hena, Iva, all these different places? Where are their gods? They didn't deliver them. You think your God's going to deliver you? Because that's the idea. If you fought a war and you won, your God was stronger than their God. And you see this also in the book of that's 2 Kings. I know that. I think it's the Syrians, that they get defeated by Israel, who one of those occasions where they ask for help from God instead of seeking help from an idol or some other nation. So Israel defeats them. And you know what they say? Their God's the God of the hills. Let's go fight them in the valleys. And maybe we can beat them in the valleys because they know they got the gods of the hills. Well, they kind of misunderstood it, didn't they? And God even says to Israel, I'm going to give you the victory, not because you're so good and faithful, but to prove to them that I am the God of all the earth, not the hills, not the valleys, not the sea, not the land, all heaven and earth. The God, the only God. So, when Nebuchadnezzar destroys Jerusalem, destroys the temple, burns it, brings the walls down, you know what a lot of folks, no doubt, some wishy-washy, weak, lukewarm, however you want to word that, some of the Jews were probably thinking, is our God weaker? And I guarantee you Nebuchadnezzar's thinking, my God is stronger than their God. Now, Nebuchadnezzar's going to change his thinking a little bit later on, isn't he? Because he's going to get humbled. But that's what they often thought. But here's a unique thing. It's one of those evidences of inspiration of the Bible. It's just a subtle plug for inspiration. In a world where everybody thought, you lose, your God is weaker, here are all the prophets, and especially Jeremiah, and he's saying, you didn't lose because your God is weaker. Your God is stronger. Your God is the only God. You lost because you are being punished. And you can take your lumps, you can go into captivity, you can deal with it, and it is what it is. It's your punishment. Or you can resist, and you will die. Some of you will die by the sword. Some of you will die by famine. Some of you will die by, sword, famine, pestilence. He said, that's your choice. But you can go out and defect, essentially, surrender to Nebuchadnezzar and go into captivity. Oh, they just wouldn't hear of that. In fact, they want to kill Jeremiah many times because he's such a traitor and he's bringing down morale. But it's a unique thing there. He says this is punishment from God. It's not an evidence of God's weakness. It's an evidence of God's holiness. You have defiled the land. You have defiled his temple with your idolatry, with your disobedience. And he says it's nothing to do with God's weakness. It's everything to do with God's holiness. And Ezekiel even has this vision of the Spirit of God leaving, departing from the temple, as if to say, hey, don't think that the temple is going to save you. Oh, God's here. We can't be defeated because, hey, God's left. God has left the building. That's basically what he says. So you have that aspect, but the synagogue worship began to pop up because, again, you don't have that centralized system. One rabbinic tradition has it that there were 480 synagogues just in Jerusalem. Even these small villages in Galilee had synagogues at the time of Jesus. But just about anybody, any halfway competent Jew could speak in synagogue. In fact, you see this in Acts chapter 13 because Paul, we said he's always going to go to the synagogue, right? Is that first bell or second? Oh, thank you. So he goes in Acts chapter 13 to the synagogue. And the fellow gets up and he's doing his thing in the synagogue and he says, does anybody have a word of exhortation? And we're careful many times in our services about doing that. And listen, hey, I understand it because I've been to some places where somebody might say, does anybody have a word? And some fellow stands up and it's just like, okay. And you just don't know what. I've told you before about Brother Wheeler. I just went blank. Bill Wheeler in Centerville, Alabama, when I preached there, some young folks came and this fella, I don't know. I don't know if he was just ignorant or if he was just crazy liberal out in left field, but he got up and basically taught faith-only salvation. And so, Brother Wheeler said, I couldn't just let that go because, people, they leave here and they never have a chance to speak to that same crowd again. So he said, I had to get up and he tried to be as kind and tactful as he could. And If you knew Brother Wheeler, you know he's one of those people like Brother Elkins. He could tell you just how wrong you are, and you sit there and go, thank you. But but he said, I felt compelled to say something because it was so off. And so I understand, being guarded and being careful. I think there's wisdom in that. But many times, if you were a Jew, and there's no indication in Acts 13 that they knew Paul. Oh, look, there's Paul. Paul, stand up and speak to us. They just kind of said, does anybody have a word of exhortation? Paul's kind of like, yeah, I got something to say. Oh, say on, brother. And they kind of regretted that themselves after the fact, because now he gets up and starts talking about Christianity, and they're going, wait. But, that's all this is happening in the synagogue. Pfeiffer spends a lot of time in his book talking about the building, the service, and it is interesting, how they would conduct the service. But actually very similar to New Testament worship. Obviously, there was no Lord's Supper, because that had not been instituted until Jesus, the night he was betrayed. But otherwise, they sang without any kind of mechanical instrumental accompaniment. They prayed. They would have, it might be a scripture reading. The preaching service, if you want to call it that, kind of developed a little bit later on, but that developed, and there would be a reading and kind of a message from the Word, and they got really, many times as they could do, especially some of these sects like the Pharisees and the Sadducees, they could get real ticky-tacky, picky about, do you read the scripture in Hebrew? Do you read a translation of it? Or does it have to be read and only translated verbally? Could you read from a written translation? Some people would say no. You can only translate it verbally on the fly kind of thing. And so they got kind of ridiculous about it. Even prayers, they got very picky about prayers. How are you going to pray? And again, sometimes you see this. I haven't seen it in years, but when I was a kid, I remember some people would get really almost to the point of wanting to bind, you need to kneel down when you pray. And there were men in my home congregation that would do that. Now, none of the men in my home congregation would bind that on anybody else. That's just something they did because they felt like it was them humbling themselves before the throne of God as they came before him and led the congregation before the throne of God. But the fact is, the New Testament doesn't teach any kind of prayer posture, nor does the Old Testament, even for that matter. It doesn't teach any kind of specificity, as far as beyond the generals of, address. Jesus teaches us to pray to our Father, and he gives us some key points in what's often referred to as the Lord's Prayer, which is unfortunate because it's really more appropriately titled the Model Prayer. The Lord's Prayer would be more like John 17. But do you recall Jesus' disciples at one point came to him and they said, Lord, teach us to pray, like John taught his disciples. That seems to be a reference to how picky they were many times about prayer, and you got to say it just a certain way, and so John taught his disciples, teach us, Lord. And of course, he's going to teach them what we, again, sometimes called the Lord's Prayer, but it's better titled the Model Prayer. So again, synagogue was a place of instruction and worship, but not a place of sacrifice. And you had a minister there. He would get the scroll out to be read. You remember in Luke 4, Jesus has a scroll handed to him by what the King James calls the minister. And then when the person was finished reading, he would hand it to the minister, and Jesus does that. And then he would go and place them back. Not just everybody got out the copies of Scriptures to be read because, Scriptures were holy. But there also was that occasion where Jesus healed somebody, and the head of the synagogue, there was a head of the synagogue, and there was a minister of the synagogue, and they're not the same function. They could be the same person sometimes. But on one occasion, Jesus healed somebody on the Sabbath, and buddy, that head of the synagogue, he stood up real quick and says, hey, everybody listen up. There are 6 days you can come and be healed, but not on the Sabbath. And Jesus says, that got Jesus upset, didn't it? He says, you hypocrite. And he says, let me tell you something. And of course, we've talked about that in our Matthew class. But that's in a nutshell the synagogue. We'll hit maybe some highlights just to make sure we understand that. If you have, I know we covered that pretty quickly, but if you have any questions that specifically need clarifying, like I said, I'll probably hit the high points real quickly next week as we segue into talking about Alexander. But from this period on, during the intertestamental period, right around the end of the Persian Empire, synagogues, it's hard to overstate the importance of them in the life of the everyday Jew. And you get banned from the synagogue, your life is over. And so you begin to understand how serious that is and how important it was in their lives. But we'll touch on that. If there's anything that I may not have covered and you specifically want to make sure you understand, bring that with you next week and we'll hit on that. And we'll have a break before our worship period. Thank y'all very much.